So, a concept that I've been working on for a very long time in different guises, I call normative unconscious processes. And the idea there is to try to understand how identities get formed by splitting off and projecting outward parts of self that have not gotten social approval, have not gotten parental love, um, parts of self that would make a person feel isolated in his or her culture. These are formed from cultural inequalities like sexism, like racism, like classism. And recently I've done a lot of work on what I think of as neoliberal versions of subjectivity. How is a neoliberal subject formed? What does one have to disown as part of self to be a good neoliberal subject? If you're white and you're seeking approval in the white world, to be a good white subject. And then how do those processes end up playing out relationally? Mostly I've published things that talk about how that plays out in the clinic, in relational repetitions, where we end up reproducing the cultural inequalities that have formed these versions of subjectivity in the first place, and end up shoring up a racist or a sexist or a neoliberal status quo. But I'm also very interested in thinking about more broadly what's going on culturally, how large groups play these things out as well, and find ways to project what's hated in oneself onto other groups. I'm definitely interested in how a neoliberal subjectivity is lived, but I like to look at these things in not as a broad generalization, but more how they play out in particular gender, as they intersect with gender, with race, with class position, because it's the ways of being in terms of how normative unconscious processes play out and what one has had to split off or disown or disavow is very different if you're, for example, say a white male, a white upper middle class male, who may have been taught to, one would hope not, but I think it unfortunately is still the case, that that being a proper white upper middle class male subject still involves splitting off one's vulnerability, one's emotionality, because those things are still coded, I think, in our culture as female. So that would be what I would think of as creating a different way of being. And then when there's large groups that are experiencing something similar, like for example the white working class being dispossessed of their ways of making a living, what kind of possible responses to that trauma would exist, and how does our government, how does the way that our government responds to such a plight affect what comes next? So you'll have like something traumatic happen in the culture, and if there's nothing to contain that trauma, to work through that trauma, to even acknowledge that the trauma is happening, you're then likely to get the kinds of responses that we know are typical of responses to trauma, like retaliation or withdrawal. And those can be those can be individual processes, but they can be also large group processes. I just had this wonderful experience of presenting at an ethics conference in Austin, Texas, and have gotten really interested both through reading Freud, which is somewhat of a surprise to me, and through reading things like Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, that there is in psychoanalysis, there's a radical ethic there that I would think of as having to do with disillusionment, of insisting that people not live with the kind of illusions that are harmful to themselves and to other people. And I'm really interested right now in going more deeply into understanding that as an ongoing psychoanalytic ethic that's often suppressed for an ethic of conformity and adaptation, but it's there in our tradition, and I am very interested in bringing that forward and connecting it to things like the racial issues in the culture.